God morgen. Velkommen til Plattform. I'll do this short introduction in English. Welcome to Plattform. Platform is the lecture series here at Bergen Kunsthal. And on the occasion now of the opening of this year's festival exhibition with Hanne Borchgrevink, we are very pleased to be able to present a talk by Verwoert. He is a writer based in Berlin, and next to being a contributing editor to Frieze, he is also writes for contemporary art journals and magazines, including After All and Metropolis M. He teaches at the Piet Zwart Institute in Rotterdam, at the Appel Curatorial Program in Amsterdam, and at the Hamid Rasha School of Art in Tel Aviv. Recently, a volume of his collected writings was published by Sternberg Press and Piet Zwart Institute in 2010, called Tell Me What You Want, What You Really, Really Want. And I would also like to mention that Jan Verwoert has contributed to the catalog for this exhibition with a new essay on the work of Hanne Borchgrevink, and the book also includes a new text by Sven Olof Wallenstein and Cecilia Scheide. But now, please welcome Jan.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Shall I be using this microphone? Ah, yeah. Good morning, everybody. In talking about the... No, that's better. Got it, yeah. Okay, in talking about the work of... So I feel like a bit of a motivational speaker with this. Right now, okay, that's good. In talking about the work of Hanne Borchgrevink, I'm just calling her Hanne, if you permit, I want to draw your attention to different aspects of the work, but in explaining those aspects, I also wish to challenge a couple of key concepts that we've learned from the history of how modernist painting has been discussed. So I want to do two things at the same time. On the one hand, show my appreciation to the work, and at the same time challenge a couple of ideas that we've inherited from the history of modernist painting, because I feel one of the key qualities that I strongly appreciate about the work of Hanne is the fact that it continues a certain modernist experiment, but it radically reshuffles the cards and makes us rethink a couple of the key questions of painting in the history of modernism, and invites us to look at it in a different light, literally. The talk is divided into 4 sections. I want to start by talking a little bit about the idea of structure as an alternative to composition, and then talk a little bit in the second part about notions of temporality, the temporality of making and seeing that is inscribed into a particular way of doing painting. After that, I want to experiment a little bit with the terms of impressionism and expressionism to finally throw them out of the window, because I want to argue that some of the most exciting painting in modernism is, in a strange way, impressionistically expressionist or expressionistically impressionist, as this work, because it combines a way of looking at feeling and emotionality with a different kind of perceptiveness, other than just of, I don't know, throwing feelings out at people. That's the third part, and in the fourth part, I want to bring on a very unlikely but maybe suitable witness to the scene, which is August Macke, my favorite impressionist, expressionist, to compare his work to the work that we're seeing around ourselves, and hopefully be able to summarize a few of these ideas about structure, temporality, and feeling. I've started with a slide of a rug by Annie Albers, and there'll be more of her work later on. So it's funny to be showing slides of work that is actually around you, but it gives me a particular possibility to play the work as I'm showing it. Because what I feel, first of all, is crucial about the work is that it, in a polite but very firm way, says no to a particular traditional notion of composition. The whole traditional idea that, I don't know, a painter should produce exciting pictures through intriguing compositions. A little bit of blue over here, a provocative bit of yellow down there, and which turns painting into a consideration of taste, primarily, as we are forced to look at something that is experimentally composed to find out what the taste of the painter might be, and then continue to meditate on that. And I feel this work is rejecting this idea of composition and taste, because what it foregrounds in a very straightforward way is the idea of structure. No, like it is very easy to understand that what we're dealing with is an experiment in repetitive structuring. The work is not particularly precious about that. It doesn't foreground the artist's taste. It just gives you the rules to the game pretty straightforwardly by saying, okay, we're dealing with structures here that somehow look like houses. On the one hand, they do, and on the other hand, it is one structural device that allows for a kind of a continuation of an experiment with repetition and variation. So it's almost as if a certain structural device, which is a house, but which is also simply a device, is used almost like a mathematical logarithm, where you have a formula, and through the repetition you slowly enter into a process of variation, of modulation, of transformation, where one shape slowly takes on ever different forms and at the same time provides a structure for the experimentation, for very concentrated experimentation with color. And I believe that when we talk about this experimentation with color, it would be wrong to say that it appeals to particular tastes. It is actually something like a perceptual experiment. It is a logarithm, a painterly logarithm that generates experiences rather than giving descriptions of certain experiences. No, it's almost like a machine that through running through a particular form of thinking generates ever new experiences, which is a completely different way to think about painting than just in terms of composition and taste. No, it's not about artistic mastership in that sense. It is about understanding that painting can be more than a picture. We're surrounded by pictures all the time, pictures of things, reproductions of things. But rather than a picture, a painting can be a structural logarithm that generates, produces a very own world of experiences, and not just passively, but actively, regenerating modulations and variations of possible experiences, of color, of space, of time. Because when you think about painting structurally, it is very much also a question of how, for instance, a particular shape occupies the given space. So not just in terms of what the picture looks like, but very much in terms of what the painting is, in how it is built. You get a certain understanding of what it means for colors to occupy space and live in that space, and thereby create a particular experience of space and also of temporality. And the temporality, on the one hand, being the temporality, the calm temporality of different colors living together in one space, a strange co-inhabitation. You see that this is not kind of dramatic action, this is not Pollock, somebody, I don't know, bleeding over the canvas at night, but the idea of colors existing on a long-term basis together in a domestic scenario. At the same time, of course, it is also an experiment about how colors share space, because sometimes they have a lot of space and sometimes they get kind of strangely squeezed into the available parameters of the canvas. No? Sometimes there's a lot of space, sometimes there's more space to be divided up. And through this permutation, you have another temporal dimension, which is that of constant variation, where one thing slowly turns into another, and you have change, but you also have something like return, where the one shape that you saw in one painting suddenly returns in another, as if the one painting was thinking of the other or meditating about the painting that was before. So in a way, they share a house together, those two paintings, but they also share a time of memory, of variation, of coming back to an idea that was previously formulated that you can't get out of your mind, which then gets reborn in the next painting. So it's a strangely cyclical time, but a cyclical time of constant transformation, structured through repetition. And interestingly, that time of repetition and variation can result in singular works that are then presented on canvas as painting, but they are obviously also presented in another medium here, which has its very own temporal logic of repetition and variation, which is that of prints, no? Where you really deal with one element, which is then in a very concentrated manner pushed through a process of constant variation. So what is special about these works when we compare them to some of the classics of modernism, which in a way propagated all the ideas that I've just briefly summarized? No? If we look, for instance, at a painter like Josef Albers, who was most programmatic in his formulation and reductive approach to painting as a sheer means of structuring a process of repetition and variation to only look at color. He was teaching at the Bauhaus, later went to New York and became a very strong influence for the American color field painters. No? On the one hand, we might think that there is such an obvious and strong similarity in the way, for instance, how we see the houses repeated here as a basic shape only to seemingly allow for a variation of colors, in the same way how in Albers' paintings very often you have the very same basic structure and then a variation on the colors. And Albers' paintings are usually called homage to the square, Huldigung an das Quadrat. So it's a very devotional form of painting dedicated to one particular shape and then an exploration of color, which in the case of Albers, you could say is playful because it embraces the idea of repetition. But of course, what you see in the contrast is that the classic modernist version is much more authoritative. It gives you the eternal square. It is a homage to the square. Assumption being that maybe, and that's how Clement Greenberg, an American critic, kept writing about that generation of painters, is that it was the task of painters to reveal the eternal truth of painting. So that the logarithm that you expose through working with it is not just any logarithm, but the fundamental truth of painting. It is the square. So you do a homage to this square. And on the one hand, you can sense that gives the painting an enormous amount of focus, because you get rid of all this kind of strange details and just focus on a key question of how do we organize colors on a canvas. Just through the repetition, that question of time comes in, through the focusing on this one basic parameter, which is basically a repetition of the outside form of the painting. What you get is absolutely self-reflexive, structural form of meditation. No, like everything that is in the painting reflects its very shape as a painting, so the outside square becomes the inside square and you repeat it infinitely. But I would say what gives that painting its strange authority is that it invokes something like an eternal grammar of painting. A square is a square is a square. This is the basic logic of a medium which starts from a rectangular shape. what I appreciate enormously about these prints, or in general the choice of the form of something that looks like a house in Hanne's painting, is that on the one hand she continues that logic of concentration and reductive meditation by using a very simple shape, but at the same time I almost understand that as a form of mockery, or I hear a form of laughter when I see this comparison, because while the Albus painting has something sanctimonious and about it when it invokes the eternal square, this is just a house. No, it basically retranslates the key question of modernism, the question of structure, into another dimension, which is the dimension of everyday experience, and where a lot of this kind of strange holiness, or in the invocation of the eternal logic of painting, is put on a totally different footing. To say like, okay, we're talking about structure, but who would assume that that structure is eternal? Why do we have to get this kind of strange metaphysical, authoritative grounding for reflection, when actually what we're dealing with here is a medium in which we work every day? So why invoke mathematical eternity when the temporality in which this work is produced is everyday life? No, every day you return to the studio, and in the studio you very rarely meet eternal squares, but just the angles that happen to be built into the architecture around you, and they're never entirely straight. So I see a particular humor also in the fact that a house that would then be repeated, well, has kind of straight angles, but not fully. And then there's this kind of mock chimney on the top where it says, like, I mean, even when Mr. Albers was painting, he needed some heating, right? Otherwise, it gets pretty uncomfortable when you meditate on colors, no? So a chimney needs to be there. Yeah? So, in a particular way, I feel that this humor in Hanne's work has two dimensions. No, it's not giving up on the key question of modernism, the key question being that of reflecting painting as a structural medium. It's being very, very serious about that in this kind of concentrated meditation, but at the same time, to use a Marxian term, it puts the whole discourse from its head onto its feet by saying, like, by performing these structural meditations, we're not producing kind of eternal mathematical solutions to the fundamental truth of painting. No, but we're engaging in a daily activity of painting, which I find incredibly liberating. No? Because it's a house that you can live in. It's not just a school that you can go to. Yeah. And every school at the end of a day is a house. No, it just takes someone who has the courage to acknowledge that even when you're thinking about basic questions, that doesn't mean you become some angelic inhabitant of an eternal school of deep thought. Deep thought is possible at home. You can try this at home. And then, interestingly, I would also say that Albers has a very long breath, so he continues and continues, but there's something about these prints that it feels like they have a different sense of timing because they continue even further. They don't stop, they go on. You know, it's every day in the house of painting is a new day, so you can continue. And it goes on and it goes on at a point where Albers has already stopped. No? These are the two in comparison. But I want to explore a little bit more what it would mean for the painting to not stop, but continue in a situation and scenario which is not that of a kind of putative metaphysical higher ground, but a very, like the place of an inhabited studio where the light starts to play an incredibly strong role. Because we're not living in a kind of metaphysical space where the light would be, I don't know, the light of God's eye shining down onto the internal solutions of painting. But it is a very real life light that changes every single day. And when Hanne sent me these images, I was completely intrigued because it, for me, captures a very particular experience that you can have with painting, but actually also with houses. No, the strange thing is that when you have these surfaces around you that are witnesses to your everyday life, you see and feel time change because they stay the same. That's the case with these kind of strange silent witnesses of the house that happens to be opposite your window. And you look at it every day, but you realize the gradual change of light because the light always strangely looks similar and different on that facade of the house. So that sometimes a painting can be animated not because it prefigures and precludes all the animation itself, but because it becomes that surface on which the change of time, the change of light registers precisely because it is so simple. It is like, I don't know, a romantic comparison would be on a beach. You see how the tide comes in and out because the beach is a flat surface. No? In the same way, a painting might register time because it is very simple and you can see the light travel on it. I don't know if you have had the experience of living with a painting. There is a strange moment when you feel that it's not just you looking at the painting, but the painting is also constantly looking over you. You're having friends over and the painting is just sitting there and watching you. And you know in memory how time has changed and the painting has watched you over you. And sometimes the most powerful paintings can be those that are as simple as the wall of the house opposite you, because then the paintings start to listen and watch rather than speak all the time. So, of course, I'm condemned to be the speaking one here now, but I can alert you to the fact that there is a particular beauty of paintings that listen and watch and don't just speak and show. And that a big argument for the simplicity of these works is, yes, that they are listening paintings, they are witnesses, and they recognize the beauty of a house that watches you. To give a different spin on the Albers now, this is actually a photo by Josef Albers, which makes you think that maybe he also considered the fact that when we talk about light and color in painting, maybe we're not talking about the eternal light of the final solutions of painting, but we're talking about a very real and experiential light. This is a window construction by Josef Albers, where he seems to partially acknowledge the fact that, yes, the light is changing, and maybe painting is about being a witness to the changing light. But what we're talking about here is also a particular notion of change, which is at home in the everyday. On the right, there's a collage by the Californian artist Frances Stark. If I remember correctly, she gave it the title, Thoughts and Dust Gathering on My Drawer. Because that is something that is very rarely acknowledged in the more heroic moments of modernism, where it always seems like the painter or the artist came up with a great idea and executed it in a heroic act in one moment of illumination, when, no, of course not. I mean, artistic work is usually also the work of the writer. That's why I can strongly relate to that, is domestic work. You're always the housewife of your own creative production. No? And a lot of the more heroic, dramatic, modernist scenarios are in complete denial of the fact that, I don't know, writing, painting is a little bit like cleaning the house, cleaning the dishes. It's a continuous experience. No? And when you think about it in that light of writing and thinking and painting being a little bit like dust gathering, and then you dust it off again and you start again, you do actually arrive at a different way of thinking what creative production might be about, no? Which gets you a long way away from some of the more heroic models that we've inherited through tradition. And I don't want to gender this too forcefully, but I think it's also no coincidence that the people who have been selling their work as these like very grave moments of genius are predominantly men. I strongly appreciate Ed Reinhardt But if you want to study the high art of male melodrama, of course, you can see it in the moment when a painter starts denying the fact that fundamentally he is a housewife and he just came in from skiing and just finished another print. No, but here we have the eternal reflection on the end of painting. Like at some point, Reinhardt produced only black paintings. That are designed to be epitaphs, that he was working on the final tombstones of painting, and unfortunately in the end actually committed suicide. So where you see that there is maybe a tragic misunderstanding in the history of modernism, when the idea is that a great work is the work that finishes. And as a great man, you need to be the one who finishes first. And the idea would be that an artistic act is an act towards an end, so you have to produce an ending, a closure of discourse by all means, because only in the moment of ending, the moment of death, can you be absolutely sure that you produced a masterpiece. And that's the terror of creative work as an everyday practice, because you can never be sure whether what you just did was worth it or not. No, like there is no escape. You have to go back to it, to the eternal process of questioning and insecurity, whether maybe what you just did destroyed the painting, or what you did on Wednesday was better than what you're going to do next Monday. This final fantasy of total escape, of finishing, producing the last painting, of course, offers you a very comfortable escape from the challenges of dealing with painting on an everyday life, because it gives you the fantasy that you could be done with it, that there is this escape hatch. I was the first to paint the last painting. It just then gives you another question: what do you do when you did the last painting? Very difficult. Unfortunately, then it drives people to kill themselves, but it is also a particular logic of authority that is inscribed into the modernist discourse as on the level of a constant denial of the biggest challenge that comes from the fact that painting continues. No, I mean, for generations, artists have sold us the idea that the most heroic act is to finish painting, to do the last one, when actually you could say that the true challenge is to continue it. No? And that is a pretty cowardish idea to think that you could, have the final idea, be done with it, when the hard fact of life is, no, actually there'll be a day after, and there's another canvas waiting. Now, and it takes some guts to go back to the studio and recognize that maybe the challenges of the artist, thinker, writer as housewife, and I'm borrowing some terminology from Francis Stark here, that the task of the artist as housewife might be fundamentally more challenging than that of the hero who tries to finish first. Yeah, that's the end. But it isn't, as you can see, no? Because painting continues. And on the right, there's a beautiful painting by the American painter Mary Heilman called "Save the Last Dance for Me," which I find incredibly beautiful because it echoes a lot of what we see happening in this gallery, the continuation of painting in a certain spirit of absolutely serious inquiry, but with the acknowledgement that final solutions are not what we're actually looking for, that final solutions obscure the question which is that of continuation, the challenge of continuation, and the last dance not yet having happened. No, here we have these kind of pink squares dancing melancholically, happily to the beat of, 1980s new wave electro across the canvas. No, the party goes on. The last dance hasn't happened yet. Right, and the light continues to enter the studio. That's another painting by Mary Heilman, which I find incredibly beautiful, because it goes back to the grid the square, but it multiplies the square, and it is not an internal square, it is a particular square, which I would say is the squares of tiles on the bottom of a swimming pool. No? If you ever, like, I don't know, in LA and you swim in an outdoor swimming pool, you have these incredible light reflections of the bottom of the pool, and it's a little bit like that. Though it's a continuation of modernism in a different light, literally, by looking at the importance of structure, but not in the light of the necessity to find final answers, but more to find ways of living with the square. No? Living with the square in the bathroom, or living with the question of structure when it comes to cooking. No, like how do you stack meat, tomatoes, lettuce, mustard? No, the fundamental question of the architecture of a burger becoming the foundational principle for the organization of a structural painting. No, it's the same question, but restaged with similar rigor, but in a different scenario. No, what shall we have on the burger today? Let's see. Which is cheeky, but I think far more fundamental. Another painting by Mary Heilman, another reflection on how to deal with the angle, which I also find returning in a lot of these kind of strange diagonals, and sometimes more and sometimes less precise diagonals. No? Because while with the Albers you do have the invocation of an eternal logic that presupposes that what we find in a painting is what has always already been there. No, the inside shape is the outside shape. There is a fundamental grammar, a set of rules and laws. On the left, when you look at Mary Heilman, it is more like doodling, where it's quite clear that a structure emerges, but the structure that emerges is not the structure that supposedly was always already there. It is through the performance of painting in the process that the structure emerges. A totally different way of thinking about form and temporality. No? On the one hand, the Albers in a way suggests that the only thing you can do is find what is already there, so that the temporality of production is always only that of recovery. While in Mary Heilman, in a very simple gesture, she shows that the production of structure is not just linked to a time of rediscovery, but a time of making. You generate structure in the making when you try to figure out where to which dot to go next. On the one hand, a very simple painting, but that makes a couple of really fundamental claims about how order and structure is even generated. That maybe we don't have eternal laws that we appeal to recover them, but no, we discover these and no, we produce them, we generate them in the making and trying to find out how to organize the space of the canvas. On the right, there's a painting by Thomas Abts. It's actually much smaller than that. Somebody who's been continuing this thinking of Mary Heilman, I would argue, and it's only through Thomas that I've learned about Mary Heilman. A similar logic, but only almost radicalized. These paintings are very small, and when you see them for the first time, they look as if they were giving you a gestalt, a clearly defined shape or form. But the more you look at it, the more you realize that they're actually the outcome of a completely contingent painterly process. That all these lines here, they're actually not positive lines, but they're negative lines, and they're created through the fact that all these parts of the painting have been overpainted. So actually, these are like little canyons. They're negative shapes, and these are positive shapes. They're color fields that are painted in a way that, as a gap between color fields, this shape has emerged. No? Which for me is a very liberating experience, because you see something that first looks very authoritatively, then suddenly fall apart when you realize that everything that is supposedly positive is negative, and everything that looks as if it were set in stone suddenly turns out to be something that is is based on a contingency of the time of making. Similar with these paintings by Thomas Abts, where what you believe you see at first is a simple ornament, as deceptively simple as some of these houses. At some point you realize, however, that it is actually something of a construction that she arrived at in the making, and you see this process dynamic, because there's some surfaces have been overpainted so many times that there's actually rims of color emerging here. So, which is, I would say, a completely different way of thinking about the drama of process. With process-driven painting, what we've learned is that process is all about the big gestures, when in a much more concentrated manner, the temporality of process can also very much just be about the slow emergence of a structure in the process of its own making. Much less melodramatic, but I would say way more focused and consistent. And it says a lot about the relation to order. You have a particular art that constantly evokes an eternal order, which is very authoritarian, or one that basically says, yes, well, if we arrive at structure, we arrive there in the making or in the negotiation of space on the canvas. That's another fantastic painter, Elizabeth McIntosh from Vancouver in Canada, where you equally have a dedication to the question of structuring the canvas with a similar upbeat humor of something that at first looks almost like doodling, then arriving at something that is a pretty consistent structure, but it's one that's dancing, right? And I don't want to comment on the similarities between the humor, because then you destroy the joke, but you sense that there's a similar kind of rhythm or groove in those images. It's like groovy structures. Macintosh on the right. And sometimes, like, Macintosh's paintings actually get legs and seem to be ready to dance with their own geometrical structures. Recent work by Elizabeth McIntosh, trying with kind of big collage elements in the gallery. I would say, in a similar way, acknowledging that sometimes the play of light in a gallery is what animates the work, so that therefore, if you offer a surface that echoes that kind of play, that is the furthest that you might want to go to create that experience. So that you create something like a responsive surface that offers a playground to the viewer's eye and the light. Speaking of the playground, there's another painting by Elizabeth McIntosh, and she once explained to me that she actually took it from a children's book with Paul Klee paintings. So where the idea is that you had kind of a Paul Klee painting disassembled, and you could have like the missing parts as stickers, and you could stick the Paul Klee painting back together again, and that's what she took as a starting point, where it is a dedication to structure, but in the key of the joy of play. And I also think that very often today, when we deal, for instance, like with Photoshop or Final Cut or these film editing softwares, actually all we're doing is kind of stick squares in lines. And I do think that there is a cinematic logic to painting, which is very basic in taking up the rhythm of moving squares around. No, it's the principle of film editing transferred into a logic of structural painting. But it is again also a logic of continuous experimentation and play that doesn't necessarily claim the Olymp of painting as its starting point or environment of production, but a place to which you return to continue living. That's a painting by August Macke based on his child's toys. So that is the place of play is a place to which you return, because it's also a place where you live. And not a place where things end, but a place where things continue. Interestingly, the idea of play, continuation, and structural research also leads to the necessity to think again about what craft could mean. Craft not as mastership, but craft as an artistic technique that allows you to live in a space. normally craft does have a bad name because in high modernism the idea of genius outperformed the idea of craft. No, craft is supposed to be embarrassingly domestic. While the genius is at work, you leave the craft to the craftsman or to the housewife. No, but if we reconsider the domestic environment or the everyday world or the scene of play as that scenario where the true questions of modernism continue to be raised and faced, then we do maybe also have to think about the idea of craft differently. No? And craft appears in the moment of printing, no? When the moment when you get on there and do another one, a strange moment of craft being a way to inhabit time differently, not in terms of the genius, the gesture of genius, but in terms of a repetitive productivity that is at home in the world of everyday life. And that is where it suddenly becomes clear that someone like Annie Albers, Josef Albers' partner, might actually have been even a little bit more radical in realizing the idea of structure, but on the basis of embracing craft, and through craft another temporality of inhabiting daily life. On the one hand, there's a structural composition by, I always want to say Hans, no, Josef Albers. And on the right, these are two carpets, two rugs by Annie Albers. And they are incredibly beautiful. There was a traveling exhibition with Bauhaus work recently, and the moment that you see those rugs in a Bauhaus exhibition, you suddenly realize that Bauhaus maybe wasn't only about building an international style that would rule the world, but also about making those concrete houses inhabitable, and where suddenly we're not just thinking about a logic of industrial production, but we're thinking about structural reflection in terms of craft, in terms of weaving carpets, and one carpet after the other. These are amazing, no? And maybe this is the real modernist painting. When it enters that zone of continuous reflection on, and the thing is turned from its head onto its feet, and it loses a lot of the kind of master architect, I'm gonna build, I don't know, the new Brazil kind of claim to power, and gains a different kind of sensitivity to the time and environment of everyday life. No, this is amazing. This is all Annie Albers. Yeah, you can call them paintings, but you can also call them rugs, no? Painted rugs, rug painting, structural reflection in the medium of carpets. And you do get a sense of continuation and a different way of acknowledging the environment in which that kind of thinking even takes place, no? So here we return to the beginning. And I do see certain resonances between a painting that embraces the Berger principle and a structural reflection inscribed into a rug that acknowledges the time and space around which it happens, which strikes me as being fundamentally different and no less radical than those final reflections on how to end things. And my thought is really that what we have in these paintings is an acknowledgement of all those dimensions, and where the making of the work and an acknowledgement, for instance, of the craft-like nature of prints resituates this entire discourse on a much more radically inhabitable ground. I want to briefly say a few things, then just 3 minutes, on the idea of how such structural reflections then do actually become charged with feeling, to briefly develop an idea of what impressionist expressionism could be about. No? Because the strange thing is that while those surfaces of the houses around you arguably might always stay the same, precisely because that is so, they get charged with memory and feeling. And it's a different notion of feeling that I'm trying to invoke here. Normally in the history of painting and art, we think about feeling only as events. Yeah? So there's a guy gets out on the cross, is bleeding, we see an event, the audience claps, we've had feeling, and then we go home. That is one way of thinking about feeling as an expressive event. And a lot of painting, of course, tries to imitate the event of a guy on the cross, especially the one where there's a lot of splashing going on. Yeah? But maybe we experience feeling also different in a different existential horizon of temporality, because there are feelings that cannot be forced into the open in an event. If you love someone, if you live with someone, it's never a matter that could be clarified in an event that lasts a minute. It is something that slowly grows and comes into its own over a period of 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years. And that is a horizon of temporality where maybe some of the most strongest emotions live. And if we only look at emotions in terms of events, we might be missing out on a lot of the really existential stuff. The question is then, how could you even tap or connect to these the dimensions of existential emotionality when you cannot rely on the choreography of big events? And which is what brings me back to this other mundane temporality of the daily witness. The house that says every night, darling, how was your day? How can you build that into a painting? And I'm thinking that some of these paintings, if not all, succeed very well in doing that, by invoking another temporality where things slowly change, but the colors are consistently charged with a particular form of emotional intensity. That on the one hand, it might be the deep red color of the painted wood house opposite, or in this painting by Alice Neal, fantastic painter, might just be the New York factory loft space opposite, but there is something in the red that suggests that there is a continuous form of existential emotional investment, but that exists in a particular state, in that of continuation, where there is no event. No, there is no event in the Alice Neal painting, but still there's an enormous emotional charge. So I see a strong similarity in the emotional tonality of these paintings. And someone coming from that angle, like Alice Neal, can then actually paint a portrait which has that similar intensity, like of a slow burning intensity of someone who looks back at you. And there is a sense of feeling, of persistent feeling that cannot be forced out just through a scene or a particular event. It just dwells, it lives in the painting, so that a face of somebody who you've known for years might actually be a little bit like the facade of that house that watches over you, and vice versa. And you would normally assume that that is a little bit of an expressionist portrait, because it is definitely psychological. But with a painter like Alice Neal, you experience that psychological interpretation inhabit a completely different sense of temporality, which is that of, I don't know, continuous friendship, I would say. This is a painting by Katharina Wulff, a contemporary German painter, who I think has a similar quality to her work. You know, that a portrait or self-portrait, I guess, would have this kind of slow burn intensity, because it dives into this different sense of time, a sense of time that you would normally otherwise only get from, let's say, a tree or a house or facade. It's an intensity that persists. As the face of the person looking back at you from the mirror every morning has the similar kind of uncanny presence as that of the houses around you. No? So in that sense, I feel like a house can be a little bit like a face. No? And then what we're then dealing with is a sense of emotion that is not so much related to the idea that there is some putative insight, that our emotions are somewhere hidden deep, I don't know in which organ, like the liver or the stomach, and then they eventually come out. But the emotion is there on the surface, The emotion is on the face, it is between faces of people as facts that happen between the surfaces, the faces that are turned towards each other. I'm paraphrasing Jean-Luc Nancy and Emmanuel Levinas, two philosophers who think very much about emotions as an intersubjective occurrence and intersubjective events that are triggered by the fact that existentially we face each other. That's how Nancy says it. We are born facing each other. Or Levinas says it is the face of the other that holds me hostage. I'm exposed to the feeling through a face that is turned towards me and from which I cannot turn away. And so in that sense, a house that faces you might actually become a very emotional surface because it is turned towards you, and in being turned towards you, it consistently confronts you with a particular mood, tonality, that is partially expressed through its own surface, but partially also through the fact that it reflects your own mood. You know, that emotions could be considered something that charges surfaces, but that also reflects from surfaces, like between faces of people that face each other. That's from Carl Theodor Dreyer's The Passion of Joan d'Arc, a film that is about portraits and faces only. And I have to say, I do actually like Oscar Jorn a lot, because he's exactly that kind of painter who would think about emotions, I think, not as something that comes from the deep inside and then is projected out, but it comes from the flat face. Emotions are about facing, creatures facing each other. No? There is, on the one hand, a strange sort of flatness about Jorn that is just all pointing outwards. It's not the drama of, like, I don't know, from the depths of my stomach out. It's just like, no, it's all in the act of facing, and therefore I think it's even more psychologically powerful and funny, needless to say. Yeah? There is an acknowledgement of the emotions living between people being expressed through the act of facing one another in the same key that somebody or something that is around you would face you every day, again and again, as you live in a particular place with a particular someone. Which actually also means that the moment you experience and describe feelings as something that is not necessarily linked to some mythological insight, but as something that is outside, between you, understanding the emotional nature of a space has a lot to do with perceptiveness, with listening and looking rather than just talking. And I do feel like, to just briefly throw that in, the beauty of Munch actually also lies in the fact that in all his psychology, he was always looking and observing. That again, as in Neil, you have someone who would be qualified as an expressionist, who is actually also deeply impressionistically, as he realizes those emotional tensions that are in the spaces between people and that are reflected by the surfaces that are faces and houses and bits of nature that compose the environment in which emotions build up over a long period of time. And we on the one hand, yes, there is the Scandinavian red painted house, but it is also an emotionally charged surface that persists, and which one needs to observe, to impressionistically observe, to even understand what expressionistically that surface would be charged with. And I have to say, I strongly reject and detest German expressionism. I really sincerely hate it. Because a lot of the times it feels like, listen guys, like you were so busy expressing that you never realized that you didn't have particularly much to express. I mean, like an upper class person, what do they, I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, the most exciting paintings by most German expressionists is when they had a weekend of nude bathing. Then finally something happens and you can see it because there's a little bit happening in those paintings. It's the drama of the artist who never starts listening because they are so busy expressing all the time. Yeah? Big difference, I would say, is August Macke. Because even though he's, I don't know for what reason, is officially qualified as an expressionist, I can't actually see why. You have somebody who's genuinely looking and listening. And interestingly, then we return to a similar kind of temporality of emotions existing in a world where certain silent witnesses are present in the form of houses. No? Like it seems like that the architecture of the Munch painting here continues in the architecture of a German small town. And we do, yeah, I don't need to comment on that, it's obvious. We see the facade returning as the surface that is the witness to an emotion that persists. An emotion that persists, yet in the key not of an event, but in the key of a daily life. So Katharina Wulff on the left and August Macke on the right, now left. And some of these days are definitely gray, but you can also see that the gray day sometimes, like the light changes, so that even on a gray day, you have a particular strange sense of life. Huh? I mean, I don't need to comment on that in a city where supposedly it rains a lot, but and I see that kind of strange beauty and ambivalence. There is an enormous strength in acknowledging the ambivalence, also not of final emotions, but of emotions that constantly change and oscillate and transform themselves in the key of this kind of, in the observation of the everyday. Katharina Wulff again, and another early August Macke. And that's something that I found on the internet, someone who discovered that they can do kind of knit August Mackes, which I think is, again, coming back to Annie Albers, is a completely consistent logic. No, I think August Macke paintings should be knit. Yeah? It makes complete sense. It is conceptually very solid. Yeah? Because it continues that kind of thinking about where we even are when we talk about those feelings and reflections. Yeah. Whoops. Okay. Allow me to show you some final. So it is the rug, but it's also a rug that doesn't actually only have to relate back to the mundane, but it can also, of course, invoke the fantastic, the adventurous, or the adventure of an everyday life in a place that might be very familiar, but at the same time also continues to surprisingly change. So that is August Macke painting in Algiers, and the same cafe house scene again and again and again. Yeah? And it feels like probably either this was the view from his room or the cafe to which he would come again and again and again. So even here we have the experience of the supposedly miraculous become particularly powerful because it is brought back to the time of living in an environment like that for a longer time and going through constant, ever so slight variations. And the magic, I would argue, is neither in one nor the other painting, but in the fact that we experience this return. As a temporal and spatial horizon, yeah? And it goes on and on and on. Yeah? Eventually, it's even like it crosses spaces where the bazaar on the one hand becomes the Parisian shop on the other, and the shop in Paris suddenly becomes a place in Germany. So it's not. I'm not also trying to, by showing this, I want to say, like, I'm not saying that one has to keep it local. But that those places that allow for the continuation, that become the home to a particular experience, they can be places that might be a particular situation in Scandinavia, but this situation also, as a logarithm, translates, no? As you can see. What's beautiful about those, and that's why I think Macke is particularly strong, is that here emotionality and looking are brought together in an experience of becoming. That looking is never just passive, but that in looking you become what you look at. No, it's just like these women and children looking at the dresses become a little bit like the dresses in the same way that the dresses become a little bit like them. No, it's mimesis understood almost as mimicry, yeah? And an active act of becoming. That's recent work by Paulina Orlowska, celebrating how in 1970s, 80s Poland, people would kind of improvise their own avant-garde fashion and become what they had in the magazines. So she did the she repainted images from magazines that were giving people cutting, like knitting advices, and parallel to painting these paintings, she had those pullovers knit. So insisting that one becomes the other, if you look at the experience of becoming in the light of everyday transformations, not in terms of acts towards an ending, but more as reflections that occupy a particular space of becoming. That's the fantastic New Yorkie painter Florentine Stettheimer was painting in the 20s and 30s, and always had her artist friends over in her salon. I think Duchamp is somewhere there standing, contemplating, not in a solitary matter like Reinhardt, but acknowledging that even and especially intellectual discourse has a lot to do with mimicry and mimesis and looking at each other and becoming each other in the process of looking and listening to each other. On the right, that's a painting by Silke Otto Knapp of the Salon of Florine Stettheimer. So a place where painting and discourse is situated in a living environment, and precisely because of that is such a generative space, like in this place. A place of play, a place of co-inhabitation. So one final thought, and then I'll end on August Macke, and this idea of imitating, looking at each other, listening to each other as a moment of becoming. Some of the most beautiful Mackes are actually, that's one of my favorites. It's a drawing from the zoo. I think it's Berlin Zoo. It's just called Being with the Elephant, where he actually radicalizes this idea of looking as becoming, I would say. You can sense that that is probably made on an afternoon in the zoo, and it's kind of quickly done. So it's entirely impressionistic in that sense, but it expresses a deep sense of becoming elephant. No, as you can see there on the, this is even more radical, no? Or becoming bird. In the act of looking, you become bird. There's a beautiful passage in Adorno's aesthetic theory where he talks about mimesis, the old idea of drawing after nature in terms of becoming, in terms of solidarity, that he says whenever we draw after something, we show a deep solidarity towards it. It's a little bit like the wrist becomes the thing that you draw. So in that sense, he says about, like, that mimesis is like mimicry, it's really like imitation. Like not representation, but if you draw after something, it's an act of imitating that thing, as if I would kind of imitate the person opposite me, right? And in the act of becoming that person, so like imitating the elephant is a little bit, yeah, being with the elephant, becoming the elephant, where listening and looking becomes an active act of becoming. Which is, I think, more than a lot of the expressionists busy expressing can say for themselves, no? Because expressionism is so much about the promise of transformation, when I would argue the work that is truly transformative in the act of becoming is very often impressionist work, because in looking at the thing, in being with the thing, you produce something that is a little like the thing, that shows the time you spent with that thing, in becoming a little like that thing. So that's the note on which I would want to end, by saying that something that might at first look entirely undramatic is actually absolutely radical in its implications, by raising the question of modernism, of how to structure space and time in a work, yet not in the key of the idea of a heroic escape, but in the key of facing that question again and again in the horizon of everyday temporality, also as a way of acknowledging that in that horizon of lived time, you can experience a particular form of emotionality in that moment when things face you again and again, and you face the things that face you, and acknowledge that moment of conviviality and living together as particularly that horizon in which the strongest emotions manifest themselves, and not just in dramatic events. And the final note that I wanted to add by pointing to Make is that this moment of living with a painting, through a painting, in such a continuous space of experience, particularly because it is so much about listening and responding and reflecting, might be more transformative than a lot of these dramatic actions. Because if we ever transform, maybe it is through imitating, through listening, through responding, that in that moment we truly transform within that long-term horizon that I believe we can experience in all these works. So,
Thank you so much for a very, very inspiring talk. You're giving us a lot of things to think about when seeing the exhibition again. Is it okay if anyone has questions?
yeah.
Bring the microphone to those of you who want to have questions. There's one here.
Well, I think that this is very interesting what you're saying, and I believe you're presenting, from my experience, half of the truth. And when you flip the coin over, there's the inevitable rise of the hero.
Yeah.
You can't escape the heroic. It's always going to... The housewife, unless your housewife is a Zen priest, seeks escape from the mundane. Thelma and Louise.
Yeah.
And so that escape is into the act of escape. You can't eliminate the other side of the coin.
Why not?
Well, because it's unrealistic. As a musician, you have to constantly embrace both sides. Mm. There's that place, though, where the act of making something move from craft to something more, you can't really put your finger on it.
Yeah.
It's a bit, they're both true. What you're saying is less obvious and needs to be said, especially in Western culture. That's all.
I mean, one obvious irony is that I am a single figure performing here and expressing all the time thoughts about that are supposed to raise doubts about single figures expressing. But in that sense, you're right. But I think for me, a critical force in art is the potential of art to change our understanding of what value is and give you a different sense of what matters. And so I think like work is not just critical when it kind of confrontatively addresses certain issues, but if it, in a long-term process, gradually and strongly shifts our understanding of values. And in that sense, I always feel, yes, a work produced by one single artist can still always ask the question of what does it even mean to create a value, or from which position, with which sense of agency, with which self-concept are we creatively acting, and what values are we producing? And I only try to throw in this idea of the housewife also to kind of gradually erode it and shift it, but also to say that there is a fundamental cultural productivity which is not that of the short term heroic event, but the long-term generation of value, the long-term rationality of working on structures and slowly shifting them and acknowledging the emotionality that is inherent to them.
Inquiry is everything. That's great.
Yeah.
But inquiry inevitably leads to a box.
Yeah.
And once you're inside the box, to break out of the box often requires a very heroic, even violent effort.
Yeah.
Not just a simple continuation of the process that you have been doing in the past, or you'll remain inside the box and your work will not move forward.
Yeah. I'm not so sure. I insist on talking in terms of shades and gradual transformations, and that would also lead us to reconsidering ideas of what change even means, and a particular tradition would make us believe that change is linked to transgression. That's a modernist idea, to think through transformation as inevitably being transgressive, that it's breaking out of the box is the only way how change can visibly register. And I'm more and more thinking, or the more I've been teaching art and dealing with transgressive people, that in the end of the day, what's truly transgressive is translation. Like what's more radical than transgression is translation and transposition. Because, I mean, there's one of my favorite lines from Johnny and Mary by Robert Palmer, where he sings, well, there's this one devastating line where it says, Mary counts the walls, knows he tires easily. Where you know that there is something about transgression, that people who just only build their agency on that, they do tire easily. And then the moment when the real things happen is usually after the guys have finished transgressing, then the questions do come back on the next morning, and then what do we do with them? And then I believe in transaction, translation, transposition as those activities that actually acknowledge the temporal horizon on which boxes start changing their shape, no? Because you translate, transpose them. That's just like I acknowledge what you're saying, but I'm just thinking, like, if we think about horizons of cultural transformation, I'm not so sure about transgression, because I think it tires easily. Yeah.
I think we should open up for more questions if there's anyone else. If not, we thank you again, Jan Verwoert.
Okay.
But